What's going on? Welcome back to Dead Cells, and update 3.4 is now released in full. This update is named the Clean Cut. I apologize if this overview video is going to be a day late. I had something come up yesterday, so I couldn't get it on time. Alright, so let's take a look at the new features. There's going to be 2 new weapons, and then I'm going to kind of review them and give everyone my first impressions. There's some new changes to the training room as well as boss rush, and then we'll take a look at the new changes for some of the mutations in the game. Let's keep it short and sweet, so let's get started. The Sewing Scissors is a huge pair of scissors that scales with survival. It has 2 attacks in its combo. And if it kills any enemies that it hits, any other enemies that are also in its damage radius will be instantly killed. I was actually really surprised that they didn't change anything of how this mechanic worked, because a lot of the cases it's actually really good. So for example, if you're coming up to an elite and there's a rat that's right next to it, if you kill the rat and hit the elite within the same attack, the elite will also be killed. So it really puts into some lateral thinking on your part, where you kind of have to time your weapons so that you kill something and then it also targets a much larger enemy to get full value. And what's something even more surprising is that the scissors can actually also insta-kill enemies that are shielded. So if you go to the promenade and you kill one of those explosive bats and then an enemy that is shielded by one of those dummies, the shield does not protect them from the scissors. And I really like it when the game does this, but surprisingly, the Sewing Scissors is probably at its best on higher boss cell levels, because enemies will teleport to you. If you're coming up to a large enemy, and then you can just lure like a small rat to your location, and then get both of them with one fell swoop. The next weapon is the Giant Comb. It is a brutality weapon that has 4 attacks in its combo. The first attack will launch enemies into the air, and then it will deal critical hits to enemies that are airborne, aka not touching the ground. It's a very interesting gimmick, and if it works, it feels absolutely amazing. But as I was testing this weapon, I also found out that different enemies in the game will have different weight values. That's one way to put it. Essentially, some enemies won't be lifted into the air as easily as others. And in the case of elites, it's going to be really hard to lift them off the ground. Now, I pretty much racked my brain of what kind of other support weapons you can run this with. It just feels like there's not enough support for this kind of playstyle. But one thing I did find to work very well with the comb is the Giant's Whistle, as the Giant will launch whatever enemy into the air. Usually this will be elites, and if you use it on any other enemies, they're probably just dead to begin with. So I enjoy the new playstyle. Though it is going to be a bit wonky on how it works. Sometimes you have to delay your attacks intentionally, so to catch the enemies while they are falling down. There's also a bit more complexity with it, as you will get free crits on any enemies that are flying. So think about those buzz cutters, think about those harpies from the Castlevania DLC, as well as some bosses such as Conjunctivius, since they are technically airborne and not touching the ground. It's a cool new gimmick paired up with a pretty big learning curve. And luckily, if you want to unlock these 2 weapons, the unlock methods is actually really simple. If you go to the tailor, aka the room you go to change your skin, you will initiate some new dialogue, and then he will give you the scissors. Upon returning, you will get the comb. Speaking about the tailor, you can now add the Bobby version of the beheaded's head onto most skins. Most in this case usually includes skins that don't have like a defined head. So it's definitely going to be a no-go on most of the crossover skins, as well as something like the snowman. But it's pretty cool that you can do this now. Next up, they've added a new DIY mode in Boss Rush. In this mode, you can now specifically choose which bosses you want to face in the run, including the ones that are the buffed up or the upgraded versions. It's quite cool that takes some randomness away from Boss Rush. In addition, the bosses from Return to Castlevania have also been added to Boss Rush, as well as the training room. So now you can safely practice against Death and Dracula without losing much progress. Next up, the training room has also received a pretty big overhaul. You can choose a lot more settings on how you want to scale your damage as well as enemy damage now. They will even show you the depth level as well as the recommended gear level for that section of the run. You can now specifically select which weapons you want, including what level, quality, as well as colorless or legendary variants. You can now freely choose the amount of scrolls you want to give yourself in order to better mimic what it's like to be in a real run. There's now 3 new rooms that you can train in, each with their own flair, mostly just different terrain as well as some traps here and there. There's also a training dummy specifically if you want to test out your DPS. Let's move on to the reworks now. There are a couple of mutations that got completely reworked. The first one is combo. There is now an actual combo meter. Your damage multiplier upon hitting an enemy with a melee strike within a 2.5 second window will now scale exponentially. It technically goes on forever, but it will reset if you don't hit anything within 2.5 seconds or you get hit yourself. Tainted Flask. It can recharge even if your flask is not completely empty. As long as it has 1 empty refills, you can now use it. They've also added 1 more elite into every biome. Again, this is one of those cases where it might be more viable on higher boss style levels since there are going to be more elites. Networking. You can mark enemies with any range attacks, so it doesn't have to be an arrow specifically. The Berserker Mutation. I've actually kind of showcased this in my Wrecking Ball run, but the damage reduction now stacks and you are now immune to stuns. Necromancy. Instead of capping at 50% HP, you can now gain health regardless of how much HP you have. It will scale off the max HP of mobs that you kill, but its effectiveness will get weaker as you get closer to max health. Frostbite now stacks with slow effects and acts as a stack on frozen targets, and I'll kind of explain how this works. So the slow status effect kind of got a rework. The slow status can now stack up to 5 times, each stack giving a greater slowing effect, and then when it reaches 5 stacks, the enemy is frozen. So how Frostbite works in regards to this is that the ticks of damage you get from it now scales with how many slow statuses it has on an enemy. And then if it's frozen, which in this case it will have a maximum of 5 stacks, it will reach its full effectiveness. And on a separate note, Frostbite is now a colorless mutation. Dead Inside now doubles your life total but prevents all sources of healing, except for recovery. The only places where I used this before is in final bosses where I didn't have any flasks remaining, because in that case, it wouldn't really bother you that much since you can't heal anyways. Last but not least, Disengagement. There's no longer a cooldown, and it can only trigger once per biome. I've talked about this a little bit in my alpha preview of the update, but I honestly don't think this is that big of a deal. A boss fight is really not going to last more than a couple minutes, and having an effect that saves you from dying every biome is still pretty powerful. There's some other minor enemies and weapon changes, but I won't really get too much into them since they're not that major. So that's gonna be it for this overview video. I know it was kind of a short one, but I really appreciate the quality of life changes. It adds a greater degree of freedom when you're in the training room so you can better practice against the bosses, against every single scenario that you might think of. Anyways, enjoy the game, enjoy the update, and I'll see you all next time.